Hello, it's Toaster Party, and today I'm doing a top 5 list for the best free-to-play Master Duel decks. So Master Duel's been out for a little while at this point, and not a lot of people have a ton of money to be able to spend on this. But it's still a very good way to be able to play the Yu-Gi-Oh! Trading Card game, even if you don't have a lot of money to spend on it. While that does bar you from playing some very specific decks, there are still a lot of very powerful options that you can play on Master Duel. And here is my list of which of these is the best. But without further ado, let's get into the list. Up first, we have number 5, Lunalight. This is an incredibly powerful deck that most of what you need to get for it is at the super rare rarity. And while there are quite a lot of super rares that you need for this deck, which kind of keeps it at the number 5, most of the ultra rares that you would want for this deck are just generic extra deck staples. And what also helps mitigate the amount of super rares you need is that most of those super rares are all easy to pull from the pack which this deck comes from. Another really powerful thing is that this deck has 3 Tiger instead of the TCG's 0 Tiger, and it also has 3 Tanky instead of the TCG's 1 Tanky, which means the deck is both incredibly consistent and has access to a very powerful loopable card like Tiger, which means that the boards that this deck can put up are pretty insane. But up next, we have another really powerful option, that being Pendulum Magicians. Most of the most important cards you need for your Pendulum Magicians comes in a structure deck that was 500 gems for each copy, so you just get 3 copies of that and you have a lot of the most important pieces you need. And another thing, unlike in the regular TCG, Electromite is at 1 instead of 0. Electromite is probably one of the most powerful Pendulum cards, so this just helps push the deck to a whole new power level. And another thing, while a lot of other Pendulum cards are limited in Master Duel that aren't limited in the TCG, like Harmonizing Magician and Chronograph Sorcerer, the deck also has access to a lot of other cards that are legal in Master Duel that are banned in the TCG. Stuff like Astrograph Sorcerer. And another thing is that alongside Pendulum Magicians, there is an easy-to-play and legal FTK that you can play in this deck if you really want to. That involves summoning Starving Venom Fusion Dragon, the Supreme King variant, which is banned in the TCG, legal in Master Duel. What you do is you make 2 of the Supreme King Starving Fusion Dragon, and then you copy the effect of the Lyrilusk Fusion Monster, which can be made off of an instant fusion, which you can easily search off of a Predaplan Verte Anaconda. But let's move on to the next list, that being number 3, TriBrigade. This one is an extremely accessible budget list, where the only ultra rare you really need for the core of the deck is Shureg. And while you'll need 2 of those, only needing 2 ultra rares for the deck core is very nice, which means it's a lot easier to get to the other ultra rares that you would want to be playing, such as hand traps. And with regards to the super rares for the deck core, the ones that you really want are just Farigite and Bearbrum. And if you really want to play the quick play, I wouldn't recommend using super rare points on that. It's pretty easy to pull from the pack. In fact, all of the super rares are super easy to pull from the pack. And the good thing about TriBrigade is that it is a very competent mid-range deck that can easily have other archetypes splashed into it. It can easily splash in with other archetypes, and it stands fairly competent on its own. And another thing, as I said before, Tanky's at 3, so the deck is very consistent. But let's move on to number 2, Virtual World. Man, this deck is incredibly powerful. And one of the reasons why this deck is incredibly powerful in Master Duel is VFD is still legal. The true king of all calamities, a basic 1-card FTK, is a card that is still legal at 1 in this format. While it is possible to stop that card, it takes some very specific outs to be able to deal with it. And Virtual World is notorious for being able to put the stop on quite a few of those outs. And another thing is that this isn't just the Virtual World that we play during Phantom Rage format. Well, I wasn't playing during Phantom Rage format, but there's also a lot of additional pieces that got released in the time of when the TCG banned VFD and Master Duel. So there's a whole lot of new Virtual World cards that you can play now alongside of True King of All Calamities. And even without the True King of All Calamities, Virtual World is still a very powerful and competent combo deck. But let's move on to our honorable mention before we get into the number one on this list. Honorable mention here goes to Invoke. While it's an incredibly powerful deck, and the core is pretty budget, just a lot of super rares to get the most important pieces, for a complete deck, you'd need a secondary engine to pair it with. And the secondary engine is going to cost you a bit more than what I would consider fairly budget. It would take a bit more time than what you might want to put in. And the necessity of having to get that secondary engine keeps it off the list proper. But Invoked is still a very incredibly powerful strategy that if you can get all of the pieces to it and you can splash it into a different deck, I would highly recommend doing so. Normal Summon Alistair is a very powerful move right now. And on to the number one pick, it's Elvish. This deck is insanely powerful and insanely popular in Master Duel for a good reason. It both plays very well with and against the best hand trap in the game, Max C, because Eldritch decks don't necessarily need to take the Max C challenge if an opponent activates the Max C. You can instead just let them cycle the Max C for one card, basically wasting an incredibly powerful hand trap. Another thing is that it both stands well on its own as an archetype, and a lot of the really powerful cards that you'd want to play alongside Pure Eldritch are only rares. Torrential Tribute, just a rare. Forbidden Chalice, which is not as good as, say, Forbidden Droplet, again, only a rare, and still a very good option for a very powerful back row deck. And also, 3 skill drain is a thing if you want to play the stun variant. And another thing, it is the most complete competitive deck on a budget, as the only ultra rare in this deck is Eldritch himself. While you want to spend 2 supers on Curse Eldland, I'm fairly certain that the rest of the deck is just, again, a bunch of rares. And because the engine itself is so big, it doesn't really take that much to fill up the remaining space with budget options. And not so budget options once you get access to hand traps. And it's also a very incredibly resilient control deck because of how much the deck floats. Any deck that intends to go into the long game, you are going to be matching them pace for pace. And if you really want to move on to splashing things into this deck, it's incredibly easy to splash other things. I am currently on a very powerful Invoked Eldritch list, and the splash of just adding Invoked stuff to this just makes the deck even sweeter to an already sweet core. Well, that's all I have for today. Thank you all for watching. Hope you leave a like, comment, and subscribe, and I hope you all have an excellent day. Bye.